let's have a look at the cloth modifier. Okay, so I've got a Grim Reaper type character mocked up here. Okay, so I'm going to turn off Turbo Smooth on the head so you can see this is just low poly stuff. I'm going to show the edged faces. Okay, simple geometry. So creating this cloak is pretty simple. You just pull these pieces out from a box or a spherified box, and it's pretty straightforward to construct this. So it's just the skull and the cloak. Okay, so we're going to use the cloth modifier to simulate this cloak as if it's clinging to him as he's moving around. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a rig underneath, and we're going to use cat. So we're going to go up here to helpers, we're going to create a cat rig using cat objects, cat parent, and we're going to create a custom rig for this. So I'm just going to click and drag the base out underneath. I'm going to center this. Everything is centered. Everything always starts at the center. Okay, so this is centered. I can go into the modify panel now and I can add the first pelvis or the first hub. And I'm going to put this guy into see-through mode for a minute. And I'm going to click through and select, actually I'm going to freeze him and grab the hub. Okay, so this would be like the pelvis, so I'm just going to move this down here. We'll hit F to go to the front view. And we're going to add a spine to this. Okay, so this is just to help simulate that he actually has a spine as he's running or moving along. And then we'll just add, this is also going to be where our arms come from, so we have to have this here. So I'm going to move this up to roughly his shoulders. And then we'll add another spine, but this isn't a spine, this is actually going to be his neck and head. So the bones, we only need 2 just to simulate a neck, and then I'm going to pull this down, and that's his head right there. So if I go to the left view, I'll hit L. I'll just make sure it's all centered. It should be. It's running right through the center of him right now. So this is going to be the head bone. So I want to make sure that this is pivoting from wherever his head should be pivoting from. Okay, so I'm going to just line up the bottom because this is all linked to the neck, to the bottom of his head. Okay, so along with this we're going to add arms. So I'm just going to click on this hub up here and I'm going to click add arm. So I'm going to set up one arm, and then once the first arm is set up I'll just copy it over. Okay, so right now I'm just kind of blocking things in. If your I'm not going to add fingers or anything. If your character has fingers, you can add the fingers. So the idea here is I'm going to be linking this skull to the head bone, and I'm going to set up some collision objects under here for the cloth, which I'm going to link back to the skeleton here, the cat rig. And then I'm going to use cloth to simulate the cloak reacting with the collision objects that I set up. So I'll just keep setting this up for now, and then I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to rotate these things into position. Okay, so you can just move the bones back and forth so that the shoulder lines up with the shoulder, the elbow lines up with the elbow, and the wrist is tucked in here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the top view and straighten this out up here. So you can also shorten these things by using your parameters here. Don't scale anything. Don't use scale on the bones. Adjust the parameters over here instead. If you scale anything in here, it could mess up your cat rig later. And we're also going to be linking things to this. We don't want to be scaling objects that we're linking, because it throws off the transform and it'll start skewing on us. Okay, so that's good enough for this. So I'm just going to grab the hub and create the other arm. So all you have to do is add the other arm and it should line up exactly like the first one. Okay, so all we have to do next is we're going to create collision objects that we're going to link everything back to the cat rig with. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze everything. And I'm just going to right click and hide the cloak. And what I'm going to use as collision objects, we want to have a low poly base mesh under here for the collision so that it doesn't take a long time for it to make the calculations when we use cloth. So what I'm going to use for this is under extended primitives, you can just create a capsule. Okay, so if you click this, click and drag, it's like a sphere, but when you let go and drag up, it creates the capsule part. Okay, so I'm going to have one of these down here for the body. So this will be the bottom half of the body that the cloth is going to collide with. And you can adjust the parameters here. So I'll just move this up a bit. And I'll make a copy of this up here for the top half. And I'll just pull this in a bit. Okay, so I've just got a top part of the body and a bottom part of the body for now. And I'm just going to keep copying these over instead of creating a new one. So all I'm going to do now is create one for the upper arm and the forearm. And you could also create one for the hand if you want. Actually, if you have a hand that's really detailed and you have all the fingers in there, you could create one of these for each bone on the hand as well. So we're keeping this low poly for purposes for the collision object. So you can align this to the bone, just click align and then click on the bone you're aligning it to, and you can actually align the orientation and everything as well, but I'm just going to line this up in the X, Y, and Z and manually rotate it. Okay, so I'm just tweaking the radius and the height so that it just goes to the end of the arm. And I'll make sure it lines up. And then I'll make another copy. I'm going to switch this to local, so I'm dragging the copy in the local axis. So hold shift and drag. There's my other collision object. And I'll just make one for the hand as well. So make the hand shorter. So if you want, you could also put one in here for the shoulder just to make sure the cloth doesn't droop in between here. So I'll just go ahead and put one up here with that clavicle. And I'll straighten it out. Okay, so to quickly copy all this to the other side, I'm just going to grab each one. I'm going to hold Control. I'm going to group this for now. So I'm going to click Group. And I'm going to cheat. So I'm going to take the pivot point of this group and I'm going to align it to something that's centered. Like this. I'm going to turn off Effect Pivot and I'm going to mirror this whole group so it flips to the other side. So I'm going to go up to Mirror, make a copy, click OK, and then I'm going to ungroup these. So I'm going to go Group, Ungroup, Group, Ungroup. Okay, so we've got the body blocked in so far for the collision objects. You can actually make another one for the head because this head's going to be turbo smoothed. So I'll just hold shift and drag this up for the head, and I'm going to make sure it's the right size. Okay, so I would push this out a little bit bigger than the head, just so that when the cloth interacts with this object's going to make sure that it doesn't go through the skull. Okay, Okay, so I'll just kind of push this over and line it up to the skull a bit better. Okay, so all you have to do now is take all these collision object pieces, these capsules, and link everything back to your cat rig. Okay, so I'm going to put this into see-through mode. So I'm actually going to take this capsule and the head and link them both back to the head bone on the cat rig. So I could actually grab them both at the same time. And just make sure you know what this bone is labeled as. So it's cat hub 03. You could actually rename this. I'll call it head bone. And I'm going to select both the capsule and the skull. And I'm going to click on link, but then I'm going to use select by name to try and find the cat head. So in here you've got cat head bone. So I could double click on that and it should be linked. So I'll just double check. There you go, linked. Okay, so you can grab all your other capsule pieces. Just hold Control, select everything, and we're going to hit Alt X, put it in see-through, and then we're just linking everything to the corresponding bone underneath. So I'm going to use select and link, and you can link the body to that upper hub. So I'm just going to double check that that picked up. Okay, so I didn't get it. If you have a hard time just using select and link like this, so a piece of the bone has to be exposed and it should flash to tell you it's linked. If you can't get to it, you can just use select by name, because anytime you have select and link on, if you open up select by name, it's just going to let you link to whatever you select in here. Okay, so most of these have a corner exposed, so I'm just going to click and drag to link these up. Okay, I'll come back to the clavicles because they're not, or the collarbone, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so that side's linked up except for the collarbone. This side's linked up except for the collarbone, so I'm going to do, let's see what it's actually called. I can't remember if it's clavicle or collarbone. Collarbone. Okay, so that's the right arm collarbone and left arm collarbone. So I'm going to select this, turn on link, select by name, just to make it easier. And we're looking for collarbone, right arm. Just double click. And this will be left arm. Okay, so I'm going to throw a quick run cycle on here just to make sure everything is linked up. So I'm going to go up to just click on the base, turn off link. We're not linking anymore, just select and move instead. So grab your base, go to motion panel, and we'll just throw a cat motion layer on here, and we're going to change this walk cycle. So click on cat motion editor and go into your two legs presets, and we'll use the game character run to test this. Okay, so double click and load. When I hit play, he's running, and you can just make sure all those collision objects are linked up. Okay, so far it's a piece of cake. So at this point, you've done all this work. I'm going to turn off the animation for now. We're going to save this because I don't want to have it crash on me and then lose everything. So this is going to be Grim example vid. Okay, so at this point you should have your cloth modeled underneath. I'm just going to unhide mine, and I've got this ground. I'm going to hide that again. So I'm going to grab this, and just remember we used capsules. Okay, so each of these are capsule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So all the capsules that we've created, they're the only capsules I have in the scene. And so when I load these into the cloth modifier, I'm going to know to select all the capsules as the collision object. Okay, so the first thing I'll show you is just basically how to simulate the cloth. Okay, so right now I'm going to hit Alt X so it's not see-through, we have base geometry in here. I've made sure I have enough edge loops in here that this is going to deform, but we can improve this by tessellating the mesh. Okay, so I'm going to show this without tessellating the mesh. I'll just take my cloth, or the cloak, and I'm going to go up to the modify panel and add the cloth modifier to this. Okay, so the cloth modifier is in here. First thing you're going to do is go into object properties and set up the cloth. So you can see I've got my cloak in here, but I also need to add the collision objects for this to collide with. Otherwise, when I simulate this, it's just going to fall straight through the ground. So I'm going to add objects. I'm going to go into my capsules here. Just hold shift and select them all. Okay, so I'm going to drag this window off because it's not showing my buttons down here. When I was selecting things to link, it should say link down here. So this says add. I'm clicking on add, and now it's adding all these capsules. So make sure they're all selected. And actually, before we even mess with these, let's go back to the cloak, switch this to cloth, and then choose a preset from here. Okay, so there's presets for the type of cloth you want to use. I'm just going to choose flannel. You can choose any of these in here, and then you can tweak all these settings in here. These are just settings you'd have to go back and play with if you want to adjust how the cloth reacts, but I'm just going to stick with flannel because it works well. Okay, so we've set our cloth. It's the cloth object. We've set it to flannel. I'm going to grab all these capsules now, and down here you have to turn on collision object for each one. So this is actually going to apply a cloth modifier to each capsule. So each capsule is going to have a cloth modifier now, and they're all set to collision object. So down here, depth and offset, you're going to want to probably change these. Depth, I usually push this down to 0.5. This is just how far the cloth is going to fall into the actual collision object before it breaks. And then offset is just how far outside of the object the cloth is going to read. So sometimes you might want to push this up a bit. I'll just start with 0.5 and 1.2. There's also friction that you can change in here. Make sure enable collisions is turned on, and I'm going to click OK. Make sure you click OK. If you close the window, then you did this all for nothing. You'll have to do it again. So I'm going to click OK, and the first thing you can do is click under simulation, simulate local, and you should see the cloth just drop and hang on the collision objects. Okay, so one thing about cloth that you might not be thinking about right now, each time we animate the character, we need to run a simulation of the cloth. Okay, so for example, right now, if I go into the base of this and I go down to turn on my animation, the cloth isn't sticking to the animation right now. Okay, so there's two ways to deal with this. The second way is the better way, but I'm going to show you how we could do this right now. So you could start your character in the T-pose and then animate from there, but that's not going to work for every scene. There's going to be scenes where maybe you have the character already sitting in a pose and you need to simulate the cloth from scene to scene. I'm going to show this example because at the same time I'm showing how to blend layers with cat. Okay, so let's say you have a cat motion layer like this. Okay, so if I was to add a base layer above that, actually I'm going to delete this. You have to add these in order. Okay, if you want to blend layers like this, the first thing I'm going to do is add an absolute layer. This is going to keep him in the T-pose in the beginning. I'm not going to adjust this layer. Underneath this, I'm going to add that cat motion layer back in here. Okay, so down here I'm going to put my two legs game run back in here. So right now if I turn this on, the character's running. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend these together using global weight down here. Okay, so if I want him to start with this animation layer and then blend it into the layer underneath, and these could be any layers that you're blending together here. I'm going to start by setting the global weight to 0 on this cat motion layer. So this is the layer that's showing through right now. If I turn on auto key, I'll go to frame 10, and actually I'll just go right to, let's see here, I'll go to frame 15 and we'll put the global weight up to 100. Okay, so I'm just going to double check the back here, it's at 0. Okay, so right now he starts in the T-pose and then he's going to start running. Okay, so you can use this method to blend any of these layers together. You're just animating the global weight. You just have to keep an eye on it that this doesn't shift. Make sure time warp isn't affected, just global weight. So from 0 to 15, it's 100% of the global weight. So what I can do now is turn off auto key, keep that animation on, go back to the cloth, and this time I'm going to hit simulate. So simulate is going to run through each frame and simulate the collisions of the cloth. And if our collisions are set up properly, the cloth should follow the character. So I'm going to hit simulate. You can see what's happening. So I just seen it jump back and forth. We'll see if it actually did that or not. So I can see the hands are going through the cloth. So I'm going to go back and adjust the collisions a little bit. Okay, so that glitch I saw didn't actually happen. So if I hit play, though, the cloth is actually simulated. And you'll get a better simulation of the cloth if you subdivide it before you use the cloth modifier. So the other thing to think about is, even though it's going through the collision objects, you can check and make sure it's not actually going through the mesh underneath. But there's a few things you can do to fix this too without going back to the collision objects and running the simulation again. And I'll show those in a minute. Okay, so that's the first method, is to start in the T pose and then have them run off from there. So I'll show another method that you can use, and I'm going to delete my cloth modifiers. So remember, I said there's a cloth modifier on each capsule now. So I'm going to hide this. I'm going to go back and I want to get rid of these cloth modifiers. Luckily, you can select every capsule by holding Control, and you can just remove this cloth modifier. If I don't remove it now, because I'm going to re-add it to everything, it'll just keep stacking cloth modifiers on the collision objects. Okay, so they're out of there. I'm going to unhide this again. Okay, this time I'm going to try something else. So I'm going to get rid of these animation layers here. So this time I'm going to try another modifier first. Okay, so on top of editable poly, I've got my cloak selected. I'm going to add skin wrap. So I'm going to try skin wrapping the cloak to the collision objects underneath. Okay, so this will be a little bit tricky the way this works out, but this is the best way I've found so far anyways, to have your character posed in the scene and then simulating the cloth afterwards. So you could go ahead and animate your character with this skin wrap on, and then once you've animated the character, you can go back to the beginning and you can add the cloth modifier on top. Okay, so the cloth modifier acts a little funny with this, but I'll explain that after. The first thing I'm going to do is go into my skin wrap modifier, and it's kind of like skin, except this time down here under parameters I can add not just bones but anything in the scene, and it'll wrap the cloth to it. So I'm going to click on add, and I'm going to go up to select by name, and you can see this turns to pick down here. So I'm going to expand this cat layer because all the capsules are linked to it, and I'm going to hold shift, select my capsules, and click pick. Okay, so once you've done that, you can turn your animation on just to test this. So just make sure you've got your cat motion layer in here with the 2 legs preset. And turn it on, and you can see how this sticks to the capsules. Okay, so we're going to adjust this a little bit. I'm going to click on the cloth, and I'm going to go into the modify panel, and it remembers the presets that or the settings that I have from last time. Okay, but if you go through, you'll see like normally when you first apply skin wrap, it doesn't stick properly, and you have to adjust the fall off, the distance influence. This is how far out it's going to be searching for them. Face limit, this is just one you'll have to play with to figure out how far out you want the faces to reach. I've got mine set to 2 right now, but one of the big things is down at the bottom. For something like this, you might see some of the vertices not getting picked up, and there's a setting down here, weight all points. Make sure this is checked on. Once you check this on, you should see any vertices that got left behind should snap into the skin wrap. So this is key right here. Okay, so this is not too bad. The only issue with this is that some of the cloth is sticking through the collision objects underneath, but I'm hoping the cloth modifier is going to be able to push this back out, because there's enough collision objects in here that it's probably going to push this cloth out as it simulates, and it should still look pretty good. So you can see now I can animate my character with skin wrap, and it's going to generally wrap the cloth to the character. Once I've done or finished animating, this is where you would go back and add the cloth modifier to your character. Okay, so I'll show you how to set that up, and then I'll show you problems you might run into. So first, we'll say that this animation was done. So the character started in the running pose this time, and I'm going to add the cloth modifier back in here. Okay, so again, I'm going to go to Object Properties. I'm going to add my collision objects, all the capsules. Okay, so first thing you have to do is go to your cloth object and tell it it's cloth. Choose your preset. And then you go to your collision objects after you've set the cloth and turn on collision object. Okay, this is set to 1 and 1 right now. I'm going to come back and adjust this after. Okay, don't forget to click OK. If you close the window, none of this will actually stick, so click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Simulate Local. And you can see the cloth rests on top of the collision objects. So I'll turn this off. You can hit undo and it'll snap back. If you find that your cloth is falling through the collision objects, go back into Object Properties, select your collision objects, and you can play with these settings here. So the depth is how far the cloth can fall into the object. So you might want to push this up instead, and I'm going to leave the offset at 1 for now. So I've got a depth of 1.5 and the offset is set to 1. So I'm going to click OK. If I hit Simulate Local again, it's making sure that the cloth is pushed out. So I'm going to turn this off and hit undo, and I'm going to run the simulation. Okay, this is the last step. Okay, so if you're animating your character like this with skin wrap, you're going to come back and add your cloth last, and you're going to figure out your cloth settings at your first frame of your animation. And I'm going to hit Simulate. We can watch this play through. Okay, so you can see where it's kind of colliding through at points. So again, this is where you could go back into Object Properties and play with your settings. But I'm going to show you another way to fix this without having to do that. Okay, so it's not too bad. It does go through the collision objects a little bit. But now if I click on my cloth and I hit Erase Simulation, it should erase the simulation. But you'll notice now it's stuck in this pose and it's not obeying the skin wrap underneath. Okay, so even if I hit undo, we're kind of stuck. So this is where the cloth modifier up here, if I turn it off, you can see it's still skin wrapped underneath. If I turn it on, it's not sticking anymore. Okay, so this is where I would probably delete this and add it again. and then I'll make sure to go in and set up my settings a little bit better this time. Oops, so I'm going to add my collision objects. So I'll make sure this is set to cloth. Make sure these are set to the collision object. So I'm going to push the offset up a bit and the depth this time. So 1.5 and 1.5, I'm going to click OK, and I'll click simulate local, and you can see by making those set changes it's actually pushing the cloth out a bit, so it kind of puffs it up. And I'll run the simulation again, and I'm going to show you how you can improve the cloth once you've simulated the entire sequence. So you could spend hours fidgeting around with the settings, trying to get it to not collide. But there's other ways to fix this. So you don't have to be too fussy with the cloth. Okay, you can see here I'm going to have to go back to my old settings. So I'm just going to do that again real quick. Also remember, each time you delete cloth, don't forget that it's adding a cloth modifier to each of these as well. So now I've got cloth modifiers building up in here. So I'm going to select all these and make sure to remove the cloth modifiers off of them. Okay, so you can see this time they all have separate cloth modifiers I have to remove. Okay, so we'll try this one more time. I'm going to add the cloth modifier again. Add my collision objects in here. Set this to cloth, flannel, and set these to collision objects. Okay, so this time I'm going to leave this. I'll just move this up to 1.2 and 1. I'll hit simulate local, make sure it doesn't fall through. Okay, so this is better. So I'm going to hit undo on the simulate local and then hit simulate. Okay, so you can see where there's pieces going through the skull and there's pieces going through the arm and stuff like that. I'm going to show you how to fix that. Okay, so there's a few modifiers you could put on here to fix parts like that. You could always add an edit poly modifier and use soft selection and go around and pull some of these pieces out. But on top of cloth, I'm going to add the push modifier. So if you use the push modifier, you can just push the cloth out like this, and you can push it away from the skull and any other objects it might be colliding from or with. Okay, so that's one quick fix. I'm also going to add some thickness to this. Okay, so on top of push, I'm going to add the shell modifier. This is optional, you don't have to do this. I'm just showing you some of the things you can add to this. Okay, so shell is going to give this a thickness on the outside or inside. You can push this to the inside as well. So you'd never want to put this on before cloth. This is something you would add after cloth, because this is adding faces to the inside, so you don't want to have to simulate these, because then they're going to collide through each other. If you add shell afterwards, you can see they're not going to collide through the faces on the other side. Okay, so the last thing you could do is turbo smooth this. Okay, so that's not the last thing. You could also tessellate before you do the cloth simulation. I'll come back to that after. But yeah, you could add the turbo smooth modifier on top of all of this to smooth it out. Okay, so this isn't too bad. If I play this back, okay, so any parts where it's actually going through the skull still, you can always add, like I said before, the edit poly modifier, and you could pull some of those vertices out. But we're getting close with this, so if I just select the skull and the hood, this is, in the end, this is all we're animating, right? Okay, so I'm going to run back through the whole thing one more time. So I'm going to grab the cloth, I'm going to remove all these modifiers that I just added. I'm going to remove the cloth modifier. I'm going to unhide all my other bits and pieces. I'll select the capsules, get rid of the cloth modifier again. I'm going to start over with these. And this time I'm just going to try and improve that cloth simulation a little bit. So this time on top of skin wrap, I'm going to add a tessellate modifier, and I'll show you what this does. Okay, so tessellate is going to take all these polygons and it's going to divide them up into triangles, and you can choose edge or face center. I'm going to use edge, and this is just going to give each polygon another edge for it to deform. So when the cloth modifier runs, it's going to the bits of the cloth are going to crinkle up better. It's going to have a better simulation because of this edge flow here. Okay, so I'm going to try adding the cloth modifier again and run this simulation one more time. Okay, so we've got skin wrap, and then tessellate, and then cloth on top of tessellate. Just adding these capsules again. Okay, so first I'm going to switch this to cloth. I'm going to make these a collision object. Just put the depth to 1.2, click OK. And I'm just going to run the simulation this time. So I'm going to hit simulate. Okay, if you see something like that happen, cancel it right away. You can see the arm kind of tore through there. And I'm going to have to add this again, so that was a bummer. Okay, this time I'll hit simulate logo, make sure this works okay. So if you want, you can simulate this locally because it's going to try and push these things out, and then you can simulate from there. Okay, so this time I'm going to run the simulation after I hit simulate local, because simulating locally is going to run the cloth modifier. It's going to push the cloth out from the collision object so it doesn't rip through it, and then you can simulate and you can see it sticks a bit better. And if you notice here, you can see how the cloth is bunching up differently now because of the tessellation. So this is just a quick and easy way to run a cloth modifier like this without getting too technical and without waiting too long to simulate the cloth. Okay, so again, I'm going to go back and add a turbo smooth at the very top of this, but before I do, I'm going to push. So I'm going to scrub through my timeline and see if I need to push the mesh. Okay, so maybe a little bit here. I'm going to add the push modifier. Push this out a bit like that. I'll add the shell modifier again just for fun. Okay, so this can go in or out. So I'm pushing this in just to give it some thickness here. And then I'm going to turbo smooth on top of that. Okay, so there's a few modifiers on here, but in the end these modifiers are going to save you a lot of hassle from trying to do all this stuff before the cloth modifier. Okay, so before the cloth modifier it's just a real basic mesh that we're simulating, and then we can improve the mesh afterwards with the modifiers. Okay, so again, I'm going to grab my skull, I'll turn his turbo smooth on. I'm going to grab the mesh here and hide unselected, and this is it. So quick and easy, it doesn't look bad at all, it looks pretty good. And even on top of this, you could still be adding an edit poly modifier if you have to, if there's little bits and pieces sticking through. Instead of running the simulation over and over again trying to get this perfect, you're not going to get the cloth perfect. It's going to be tough to get it perfect. You're better off adding modifiers on top and just fixing it from there. Okay, so just a quick example in case you're not sure. On top of cloth, I'm going to add the edit poly modifier. And I'll show you what I mean. If I select one of the verts in here, let's say this was sticking through, or let's say this part up here was sticking through, I can add or use my soft selection and I can pull this whole section up. Okay, so I'm going to show end result, so it's showing turbo smooth and everything, and I can just pull this away like this, and that stays up there. You can also auto key this, so I can turn on auto key and I can animate this separately. Okay, so I'm going to delete that because I didn't actually need to use it. And that's it. That's the cloth modifier in a nutshell. Obviously there's a lot more elements to the cloth modifier. You can get pretty complex. You can start pinning vertices to parts, and you can have more complex cloth simulations going on, but for a cloak like this works pretty good.